to the Investor Alliance for Human Rights webinar on the human rights crisis in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the Uyghur Region, as we will use during this webinar. This is the third webinar that the Investor Alliance is running related to the Uyghur Region since 2020, and we want to thank all of you here today, including our remarkable speakers, for the attention and action that has been dedicated to addressing this unprecedented human rights crisis. My name is Anita Dorette. I'm the Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, an initiative of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, or ICCR. The Investor Alliance is a collaborative platform for investors, together with civil society allies, to work together to enable responsible investing that respects the fundamental rights of people. We are a global coalition of institutional investors with over 222 investor members across 20 countries, representing over 12 trillion in assets under management. Our members include asset managers, public and private pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, foundations, and family funds. So for those who are less familiar with the Investor Alliance, just quickly talking about the three areas of work that we currently run. So the first thing that we do is we work to promote investors' responsibility to respect human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well the OECD guidelines on responsible business conduct for institutional investors. We do this through capacity building activities like this webinar, as well through the development of practical tools and guidance for investors, which include relating to the Uyghur region. We launched a practical guidance on the human rights crisis in the Uyghur region in August 2020. And so that's one of the tools to help to support investor responsibility. The second is through corporate engagement, where we activate a broad base of investors to take a coordinated approach to engagement with companies on their responsibility to respect human rights. We do this in close collaboration with civil society and experts in this area. And since the late 2020, we've been coordinating an engagement on the human rights crisis in the Uyghur region. We have over 60 investors engaging with no less than 60 companies, and we plan to launch a coordinated collective engagement with the automotive sector shortly as following this webinar, so more details on that to follow. And the third is that we focus on standard setting, where we engage with policymakers and standard setting bodies to advocate for the creating of enabling environments that allow for a level playing field that incentivizes responsible business conduct. And we've seen laws coming into place in the United States with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and so proposed laws in the EU and other parts of the world looking at trade bans relating to forced labor related risks. Just a few quick logistic points before we get started. The first, as you well know, is that we're recording this webinar, and the recording of the webinar and the slides that are being used will be available to all registrants shortly hereafter. The second is that all the attendees are muted at this time, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. And we have 7 panelists today, and we put aside a fair chunk of time for questions and answers. So please be ready with your questions and answers, and you can start popping them into the Q&A box, and we will read out these questions during the panel session, or you can also virtually raise your arm, and we would love to hear from you directly. So now just about the webinar today. So today's webinar, which is entitled, "Is Your Car Driving Uyghur Forced Labor?" is a very real question that we will explore and discuss today. Saba, if you can move to sort of the next slide, please. Yes, so we have an amazing panel of 7 experts, and you see 4 of them here, and on the next slide you see sort of 3 of them. Right, that's great. And and so that's cool. You can close down the slide deck now, Saba. That's great. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we have an amazing panel of 7 experts, all experts in their own rights, to discuss the issue of Uyghur forced labor in the automotive supply chain, providing expert research and data, as well as hearing from the Uyghur community and investors, and from an investor and environmental advocacy organization. I will introduce each panelist just before they speak during the 75-minute session. So let's jump into it now. And for many of you who have been looking at evidence-based reports produced by the University of Sheffield Hallam, Dr. Laura Murphy would be a name that you are familiar with. We are excited to have Dr. Murphy again with us today. She is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center at the Sheffield Hallam University. She's the author of numerous books and academic articles on the subject of forced labor and human rights trafficking globally. Her current work focuses on forced labor in the Uyghur region, including in solar, apparel, automotive, critical minerals, and building materials. And the driving force report is the 7th report so far. I think that's what she told me, Dr. Murphy. So Dr. Murphy will be joined in this discussion of the driving force report by Yalkun Uluyol, who is also a co-author of the driving force report. Yalkun is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Koç University in Istanbul, Turkey. He holds a BA in economics from Istanbul University. Yalkun is a Uyghur and was born in this region and has family still living here, or living there. He's fluent in Uyghur, Chinese, English, Turkish, and Arabic. So with that, I'm going to throw the discussion or kick off the discussion with Laura and Yalkun. And, feel free to share your slides if you're already doing that. So thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. Anita, it's good to be back talking to the folks with the ICCR. And let me ask you, can you see my slides? I see you nodding. Okay, I can't hear you, but that's fine. Okay, great. It's wonderful to get to see you and to get to talk to you again. Today, we'll talk about our most recent report, Driving Force, which is, as Anita said, about automotive supply chains and their connections to forced labor in the Uyghur region. I'm joined, as she said, by Yalkun Uluyol, who's one of the co-authors on the report and an up-and-coming rising star in research on this region, so keep his name in mind. We're also joined today by two other of our colleagues who worked on this report, Kendall Salcido and Mia Rapkin, both of whom will be available during the Q&A and panel discussion. Hi, Kendall. And we want to also mention that we work with a much larger team. We're just the people whose names are on the front of the report, but there are a lot of people who work with us who choose to remain anonymous because of security reasons, because the work that we're doing is unsafe potentially for their family members who are back home in the Uyghur region. And so they remain anonymous, but they nonetheless deserve a lot of gratitude because they are working extremely hard, and also because they do so knowing that it's a risk to themselves and their families, but they do it nonetheless. So we're really pleased to be able to thank them today too. We, as we mentioned, this is the 6th or 7th report we've done. We've worked, Sheffield Hallam University has a dedicated research team specifically now working on Uyghur forced labor and looking at sectors that the Chinese government has intentionally invested in the Uyghur region for expansion, manufacturing, farming, different sectors that the government has been most invested in, and automotive is one of them. And so we've been looking at that. But as you'll know from our report, from what we tell you today, it goes deeper than just automotive. It's the steel, the aluminum, the copper, the nickel, the lithium that goes into a car that really is what this report is about. And therefore it's applicable to the aerospace industry. It's applicable to electronics. So what we're going to talk about today, I want you to think more broadly as well about the rest of your portfolios, because automotive is just the tip of the iceberg in what we found today. I'm going to kick it to Yalkun to give a little background and information about our methods. Yalkun.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for Anita and Laura for the wonderful introduction. So I'd like to start with a bit of background. There are approximately 12 million Uyghurs and other Turkic ethnic groups living in the Uyghur region. Among them, more than 1 million have been arbitrarily detained in camps across the region. and upwards of 3 million have been used as forced labor. Forced labor can take place in camps, satellite factories nearby one's neighborhood, or in a factory elsewhere in the Uyghur region, or in other provinces within China. So in this report, Laura, other co-authors, and also anonymous team of researchers. Laura, can we move on to the next slide, please? Sorry. So our research was undertaken in 3 main phases. The first is identification of car companies linked to the Uyghur region. Then we have review of evidence linking them to the repression, especially forced labor schemes. Also, we trace them to global brands within or outside China. So our sources, the data sources we relied on included customs records, corporate disclosures and publicity, state media directives, satellite imagery. All are accessed in English, Mandarin, Uyghur, and Kazakh languages. In fact, it was a tough yet enjoyable journey with Laura, Kendall, Mia, and other talented researchers who remain anonymous in our team. So with that having said, now I will pass the floor to Professor Laura Murphy to further discuss the findings of the report. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Yao-kun. And just a reminder, I know that many of you have been on calls with us before, but when we talk about forced labor, we're not sort of arbitrarily applying that definition or, what we do is we look very carefully at evidence that the practices in the factories are meeting the definition of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, for how they define forced or compulsory labor, which is any work that's conducted under threat of penalty where someone is not doing so voluntarily, right? So we look at that and we look at the ILO's own indicators of forced labor. And then we also have we've identified ourselves some additional indicators of state-sponsored forced labor that we look out for. For instance, we look for threat of internment or imprisonment if a person were not to take the labor transfer, or we look for harassment by labor agents that people feel coerced into going. And what we found was that across the sectors or across the industries that were making the raw materials and processing the raw materials for the automotive industry, as well as the factories that were producing parts for the automotive industry, we found both the ILO's standard indicators of forced labor, signs that people were not choosing to do workforce voluntarily, and also these signs that we're noticing to be characteristic of state-sponsored forced labor, whereby the state comes in and ensures that people go to take factory jobs even when they don't want to. We're seeing people having their land transferred by the state so that they are effectively unemployed and therefore need to go and do work in the factory. So we're seeing all of these signs across the board. And so when we talk about we identified forced labor, this is the kind of rigor that we apply to that definition. We'll give you just one quick example of a company that's deeply involved in the forced labor regime in the Uyghur region, and how we came to the evidence in that, so that you understand a little bit about how we do what we do. Guanghui Group is one of the biggest distributors of automotive of cars in China, and certainly is the biggest distributor of cars in the Uyghur region. They have BMW dealerships, they have Land Rover dealerships, etc. But they also, the Guanghui Group, which is run by a man named Sun Guangxin, who came under some scrutiny in the United States a couple of years ago because he was putting up a wind farm in Texas that maybe people thought was a security risk. But he is Xinjiang's, the Uyghur region's wealthiest person. He is the wealthiest person in the region. He not only runs these high-end luxury car dealerships, he also has started producing parts. The main companies that the main factories that his company has in producing of automotive parts are operating within this particular industrial park you'll see here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Sometimes people can see my cursor, sometimes they can't. In any case,
I can see it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So this is an internment camp that has been identified to be the camp where this photo was taken. The Blue Man photo sometimes is called. It's infamous because it's one of the first pieces of evidence, visual evidence we had of what it looked like inside the camps. People have used satellite imagery and other work to identify that this is the place where that camp is located. And this yellow box is where the factory of Guanghui is located, where these folks, these men, are making mats for cars, and they're also making electronics. There's another factory in this this park that's making electronic parts. Interestingly, this particular address, this particular small industrial park within a larger industrial park, where you can see there are two other internment camps, this particular industrial park is also where there was a big case of hair, wigs being made in the Uyghur region by people who were who were coming from this internment camp. It shares the same address as the Guanghui factories. So we know that this is an industrial park where forced labor is indeed happening, where it is located across the street from an internment camp, across the street from two internment camps. And this is where Sun Guangxin himself has personally gone to visit and gone to set up factories. And we have evidence of his personal investment and personal interaction there. And he's in joint ventures with a ton of other car manufacturers, international manufacturers. And so this is one of the cases where we see a really serious confluence of all the kinds of evidence. We also have stories from these workers talking about how they were recruited by state agents to come to work in that factory. So when we did that research, we thought that we would just look at 2 or 3 parts of the car and zoom in. But what we found was that basically every part of the car had exposure to the Uyghur region. And so we looked at all of it: steel, copper, aluminum. We looked at nickel, we looked at lithium, we looked at batteries, we looked at tires and electronics and interiors, glass. We looked at all of it. And so the report is fairly comprehensive. And what it showed us was, at a glance, 96 mining, processing, or manufacturing companies that are operating in the Uyghur region that serve the automotive industry. They also serve other industries, some of them, but we know that the ones that we reported on our company for sure, in our report, for sure are operating within the automotive industry. At least 38 of them had evidence, clear evidence, meeting the ILO definition of forced labor, that they were engaged in the labor transfer programs. And we traced those companies out to more than 100 automotive parts or car manufacturing companies, showing that all those companies have exposure to the Uyghur region. And I'll mention that some of these supply chains are quite long. So, so it may be that a company that's an international brand in the, I'll start that sentence over. It may be that an international brand has very clear first-tier suppliers or second-tier suppliers that are absolutely using labor transfers and are absolutely sourcing or supplying the international brands. And then some of those connections are 3 and 4 tiers back: the steel, the aluminum, and those international brands are exposed and at a very high risk of getting Uyghur forced labor made goods. And we make that distinction very clearly in our report. Let's talk about steel, just to give you a sense of what we're seeing. Baowu Steel is the world's biggest supplier of steel, and it's also the biggest steel manufacturer in the Uyghur region. The Uyghur region produces 10% of Baowu steel, and Baowu produces 65% of the world's steel. So here's the issue. The Baowu company in the Uyghur region actively engages in the forced labor of Uyghur people. They are a state-owned company. They are enthusiastic supporters of the programs that oppress Uyghur people. In fact, one example we found, this is actually an example I think that Mia found, and Mia's on the call, so I want to hat tip to Mia there. These workers you see here were forced to march for 8 hours through the mountains during COVID in the snow to get to the factories, because the factories were cut off by snow, and the factories were on, all the workers were on lockdown. So the government supported Baowu going and pulling Uyghur people out of their homes during the lockdown, sacrificing their safety and health while other people were being protected by the state and by the lockdowns, and forced them into working in the factories. We saw that across the first months of COVID in China, that Uyghurs were being sent away both close to home and on trains filled with Uyghurs sent to other parts of China to work during the lockdown when everyone else was being protected. And so this is one of those signs to us of both the governments and these corporations' lack of concern about Uyghur well-being, and COVID really shined a light on that. And of course, they also have participated in the Uyghur labor transfers beyond that, that COVID moment as well. For each one of our industries, we've indicated a product or a company that we think is something that the auto industry can really begin to, or like kind of sink their teeth into, like something they have real leverage on, or a product that is very or a product that is certainly made by Uyghur forced labor that companies should be excluding from their supply chains. And for the Baowu case, Baowu's ultra-low carbon steel was both developed and is manufactured in the Uyghur region, and probably exclusively in the Uyghur region. This was something that another one of our colleagues discovered, advertisements of Baowu's excitement about their Xinjiang-made ultra-low carbon steel. So we're calling on companies to identify any place where they're importing Baowu ultra-low carbon steel or using it in manufacturing, and to exclude that, because we know that piece is definitely made in the Uyghur region. We'll talk about aluminum. 10% of the world's aluminum is made in the Uyghur region. And I want to emphasize this: 10% of the world's aluminum is made in the Uyghur region. This goes far beyond the auto industry. We have a serious problem that a significant amount of aluminum is made in the Uyghur region, and that many of the parts of the products that we buy are going to be tainted with Uyghur forced labor. The companies, there are about 8 to 10 major companies operating in the Uyghur region processing aluminum. And those companies are all in one way or another engaged in the labor transfer programs that are oppressing the Uyghur people. We know that there are a couple of companies that operate exclusively in the Uyghur region, including Join World. All of their aluminum comes from the Uyghur region. So any parts made by Join World and any companies sourcing from Join World almost exclusively, which includes a company called Mint that makes all of the automotive industries, or that makes many of the automotive industries decorative aluminum pieces. These companies are absolutely exposed to the Uyghur region and to Uyghur region forced labor. And then a company like Xinfa Wheels, most of its aluminum, more than 50% of its aluminum, is coming from its Xinfa subsidiary in the Uyghur region. So we're calling on companies to look into these companies, we're calling on international brands to look into the suppliers that have the highest risk, that are the most certainly sourcing from the Uyghur region and using Uyghur forced labor. Batteries is an interesting leverage point as well. There are two kinds of batteries that we look at in this report. We look at internal combustion engine batteries, traditional car batteries, and we look at electric vehicle batteries. In a previous report that we might have talked about before, we identified a company called Camel Group that is not only recruiting Uyghur workers through these state-sponsored coercive programs, but they also have put their highly polluting, lead poisoning manufacturing and recycling plant on top of a traditional irrigation system that actually still feeds local basins, water basins. This is a really critical problem. It exemplifies the way both the people and the land, the environment of the Uyghur people are treated as disposable by both the companies and the government. And so we're really concerned about the behavior of this Camel Group, which had, at least until recently, been financed by the International Finance Corporation, the development investment arm of the World Bank. But we also started to look into lithium-ion batteries, those batteries that power the electric vehicle. And what we found was really interesting. Until recently, there wasn't much going on in that sector in the Uyghur region at all. But in the last year or two, the Chinese government has really seemed to incentivize the movement of lithium-ion battery production, lithium exploration, and lithium processing to the Uyghur region. But that's only happened in the last couple of years. CATL Batteries, the world's largest electric vehicle battery manufacturer, Ganfeng Lithium, one of the world's largest lithium producers, they have both moved to the Uyghur region in the last 6 to 8 months alone. And this means that this is a point of leverage for corporations that want to not only have a transition to green energy, but to have a just transition where they can say, look, before our industry is too heavily invested in the Uyghur region, before electric vehicles are held captive in that region, we're going to put pressure on companies to pull out because we're not invested there too much. We're not so overly reliant or dependent yet. So this is another thing that we're encouraging companies to understand about where their leverage stands. We'd like to emphasize that this is not an EV problem. This is not a Volkswagen problem. This is an industry-wide problem that affects all automotive sector manufacturers, parts, replacement parts companies. It affects the major manufacturers. It affects the small manufacturers. It affects electric vehicle manufacturers. It affects those operating in China. It affects those not operating in China. It really is an industry-wide problem that requires industry-wide solutions. And we're calling on the automotive industry to create an internal collaborative system whereby they can, begin to act together to ensure that our automotive future is not reliant on forced labor. We know that what companies want to do is audit their way out of this problem, to send third parties out there and try to remediate. And we applaud the way so many industries have really taken on the advice of nonprofit agencies that say, in general, when you see forced labor, go in and act, go in and change, go and make workers' voice, elevate workers' voice. But there is no opportunity to do that in the Uyghur region. Uyghur workers are not allowed to speak freely. No auditor can go in there and work unfettered and unmonitored. And so we know that you have to pull out of the Uyghur region entirely. So that's what we're calling on companies to do. But we know that there's so much exposure and that there are 33,000 parts. This is really different from the solar industry, where you really can see where most of the things come from pretty clearly. This is much more difficult. So we have helped the auto industry to prioritize products and companies that we know they either are most exposed to forced labor through, have the clearest exposure, the clearest supply chains connecting them to them, or companies that are outside of the Uyghur region using Uyghur forced labor, so that we've had experiences where those companies have been able to change their practices. That's a place where companies have leverage. Or where, like in the industry, we know that the industry is not so mired in Uyghur forced labor that they can't, that's going to be more difficult to get out. They can have real leverage to change. So we've created this set of first steps that companies should take in addressing this issue as they're trying to trace their entire supply chain for all of their products, which is what I think they need to do, what we all agree to. And we think that governments should be passing mandatory human rights due diligence. They should be banning imports that are made with forced labor. It is shocking that the United States is the only country that has an enforced ban on importing forced labor made goods. You'd think everyone would ban that, but they don't. We really are pushing for that. And we think that that countries should be putting an emphasis on the automotive industry to make change in this arena. And as I was saying, we're calling on car companies to conduct, collaborative efforts to address forced labor in their Uyghur region, to understand their supply chains thoroughly all the way to the raw materials, to report on that so that people know about it, and to collaborate with other sectors to make change. This is where we'll stop for now, but we're really excited to get to talk to you and to think about how investors can encourage companies to take those steps that we know need to be taken. And so we'll be happy to talk more about that. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Laura, and to Yalkun. That was a great presentation. There have already been questions sort of coming in. But I think what we'll do is we'll leave that for later. Because we'll have some time with the panel to answer some of those questions. I wanted at this stage now to actually move on to getting the voice of the impacted people to this table. So I know y'all couldn't feel free to add your viewpoints, but for the moment, I'm going to really introduce us to Johar. Johar, you may need to turn on your video.
I'm not able to turn it on by myself.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Hold on, just give me 1 second. Okay, all right, great, Johar, thanks. And I'll just do a very quick introduction to Johar. And, I'm really pleased to have Johar here. Johar Ilham is an author and advocate for the Uyghur community and for her imprisoned father, the Uyghur economist Ilham Tohti. Johar has testified before the US Congress, published op-eds in the New York Times and The Guardian, and received numerous international awards on behalf of her father, including the European Parliament Sakharov Prize. Johar has written 2 books recounting hers and her family's experience in the ongoing struggle of the Uyghur people. She also serves as a spokesperson for the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, a coalition of civil society organizations and trade unions united to end state-sponsored forced labor and other egregious human rights abuses against people from the Uyghur region. So with that, Johar, over to you, and thank you for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much, Anita. Hello, everyone. My name is Johar Ilham. Thank you all very much for taking the precious time out of your day for joining today's webinar. And thank you very much, Investor Alliance, for having me today. I spent over a decade in the earlier part of my life learning art and languages, hoping to become a translator or an artist when I grow up. But I have been forced, as you can see, to become a human rights advocate and a labor rights researcher. The Chinese government left me with no choice but putting my loved ones in prison. If I had a choice, I wouldn't have chosen this life path or this career path. And many Uyghurs have been forced to be placed in a completely different and a very difficult life path and career path as well. And I wonder how many people here who are listening to this webinar knows what it is like to wake up having to Google your family members every morning, Google their names in order to obtain any information or news of them, whether they're going to be popped up on a news article or among the detainees list in a leaked government report, or sometimes among a list of deceased. But many Uyghurs know how this feels. And in fact, when I first heard about my father's imprisonment, it was from the news as well. My father, Ilham Tohti, is a renowned scholar and an intellectual who is the winner of 2019 European Parliament Sakharov Award and 7 times Nobel Peace Prize nominee. And he was one of the very first Uyghur who was arrested before the government's clamped down on the whole Uyghur region. And he was also the first person who holds a Chinese passport that was received a life sentence since the Cultural Revolution. But all he ever did was fostering dialogue between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs, and for advocating respect for religious and cultural beliefs of our people, and for equal opportunity in pursuing our dreams and the things that motivate us. When my father was first arrested in 2014, he was shackled, beaten, and denied food twice, and each time for 10 days, and he lost 40 pounds within a few months. No one knows his current condition, and it has been over 6 years since I haven't heard any news of my father. Family visits have not been allowed. We wonder sometimes if he's writing on the prison walls, or the prison guard might refuse to give him a piece of paper, or writing could be his only way to keep himself sane in the dark cell since he's locked up in a solitary confinement for the past decade. And also wonder if he is even alive. Many Uyghurs in the diaspora are wondering about a similar thing. Are their family members doing okay? Or are they even alive? This is a question that goes around in our head every single day. My cousin Nuralia Yalkun, a nurse, was also the main carer of my grandmother, was arrested on her way to a shopping mall, just on a regular sunny day like today. She was stopped at one of the checkpoints, which are randomly located every few blocks in my homeland to monitor and control people's flows and actions. She was sentenced to 10 years for having a photo and an article of my father in her cell phone. As simple as that. My grandmother passed away later last year. Yalkun, who's the other Uyghur speaker today, her father, Mehmet Yaqub, was also unlawfully detained in 2018. He's now not sure where his father is, and I'm sure he's willing to share more later. And I really wish these were just single cases and could be resolved, cases that could be resolved soon. But the fact is that the Chinese government is perpetrating human rights abuses on a massive scale in my homeland, the Uyghur region, targeting the Uyghur population and other Turkic and Muslim majority peoples on the basis of our religion and ethnicity. And these abuses include arbitrary mass detention of an estimated range of 1 million to over 1.8 million people, and a program to cleanse ethnic minorities of their extremist thoughts through re-education and forced labor. The Chinese government claims their inhumane actions as an effort for poverty alleviation, while many Uyghurs were forced to work in a factory without getting any payment, and even accompanied with mistreatments and torture. Many of them, their family members even have to bribe the guards to keep those detainees even alive in those factories. It is very clear that the purpose of these policies is not to rescue us from poverty. Instead, it is to destroy our people and break our lineage, disconnect us from our culture and roots. There are egregious human rights abuses having taken place, such as gender-based sexual harassments and abuses, political indoctrination, forced sterilization, family separations, and preventing Uyghurs from practicing our religion and culture and speaking our language freely. I learned my mother tongue after coming to the US in my early 20s because I was not able to learn it back home. We couldn't stop what happened in 1940s, but now we can help stop the current crimes against humanity if we act now. And today, I'm wearing Uyghur traditional pattern clothing. I don't know if you can see it clearly here on camera, which is called etles. I wore it by choice. But I'm afraid one day, if I ever have a chance to go back to my homeland, I will not be able to hear people speaking in my mother tongue, nor see anyone wearing our traditional clothing by choice because they're proud of it, but only they might wear it to attract more Han Chinese tourists. So those tourists will migrate to the region and dilute the Uyghur population in our homeland by request of the Chinese government. And at this juncture, no responsible corporation in any sector should be operating or sourcing anything from the Uyghur region where forced labor practices is rampant. We need businesses, governments, investors, and consumers to act together. Maybe together, we might actually have what it takes to free my father, my cousin, Yalkun's father, or over 1 million innocent Uyghurs who are trapped in what feels like now an endless life of captivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johar, for taking the time to share with us your story and the stories of many Uyghurs around the world. It's important for us to be able to hear directly from you, from impacted communities, to understand that when we are putting into effect our responsibility to respect human rights, we're doing this understanding what is happening to impacted communities. So thank you for your time. And I hope that, you know, the little that we're doing or what we're trying to do will, you know, be in solidarity with you and the Uyghur community. Thank you for your time today as well. I hope you can stay for a little bit longer on the Q&A panel. I know that you have to rush off for a hearing, but, you know, again, thank you for your time. With that, and with that very impassioned discussion, I'm now going to turn to Erin. Just give me a second. Erin is a senior program associate at the Investor Advocates for Social Justice, or IASJ, where he supports IASJ's campaigns on human rights in the supply chain, and he's been leading the work on the automotive sector. He also supports work relating to racial equity and immigrants' rights, peace, and demilitarization. Prior to joining IASJ, Erin was working in Colombia as a transitional justice researcher, focused primarily on corporate accountability within the context of armed conflict. Erin has extensive experience in human rights law and is a member of the State Bar of California. And I'm very pleased to hand this over to Erin, who's going to talk about the work that IASJ has been leading on in the automotive sector, and how that work is as well, you know, going to extend to addressing the issues relating to Uyghur forced labor that's starting to permeate, or has been permeating, the automotive sector, and starting to permeate through to the transition to EVs. So with that, Erin, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Anita. And I just wanted to say thank you to Johar also for just so boldly sharing about your experience. So if with that, can we go to the next slide, please? Just a little bit about the organization. As Anita said, my name is Erin Acosta. I am the Senior Program Associate, and Investor Advocates for Social Justice is a nonprofit organization. And we represent investors with faith-based values who seek to leverage their investments to advance human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and the common good. Our work is divided into 4 thematic areas, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'll just focus on one of our areas, which is human rights in the supply chain. So specifically within this human rights in the supply chain, we have a separate campaign, which is called Shifting Gears. And Shifting Gears started in 2018 with the question to companies in the auto industry of whether they were certain, or how do they know that there was no child labor or forced labor in their supply chains. So this work started in 2018. IASJ sent letters to various companies, auto manufacturers, tier 1 suppliers, part suppliers. We engaged in dialogues with many of these companies. And then if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm calling this our part 1 of Shifting Gears. And in 2020, IASJ published our report, our Shifting Gears report, and you can see the picture on the slide. I will also share links to what I reference after this presentation. But yeah, the report really explored the salient human rights issues and concerns, particularly as they relate to child labor and forced labor in 23 different companies in the auto industry. So manufacturers, tier 1 suppliers, part suppliers. The report basically assigned different scores to these companies based on their human rights policies and implementation. And fortunately, this was published in 2020, shortly after the Australian Strategic Policy Institute published their really important report, Uyghurs for Sale, that detailed the forced labor in the Uyghur region and also in other parts of China. So in this Shifting Gears report, we were able to reference that as one of the most egregious human rights concerns. So as part of this part 1 of Shifting Gears, we also in March 2021, along and in collaboration with Investor Reliance and some other investment groups, we sent letters, investor letters to General Motors and to Volkswagen. and we urge them to do a couple of things: to complete a mapping of their value chains, to demonstrate steps to disengage from the business in the Uyghur region, and also to publicly disclose this information and their progress in these efforts. So on the, the positive was that both companies did respond to us, but they both categorically denied that any of the parts that they sourced had any exposure to forced labor from the Uyghur region. So we kind of hit a roadblock there and didn't really have any meaningful interactions with them for a little bit of time. And if you can go to the next slide, please. This is what brings us to our shifting gears part 2, which is where we are currently in this kind of revamping stage. We're relaunching our shifting gears campaign shortly. And this time we wanted to really focus on the transition to the use of electric vehicles, or EVs, and the human rights implications in the supply chains. So we are really trying to focus our efforts on only auto manufacturers instead of looking at tier 1 suppliers, et cetera. And we really want to focus our efforts on these human rights issues that are involved in that are related to there's 8 critical minerals that we've identified that are important for manufacturing EVs. And so some of the human rights issues we're looking at are like with indigenous people's rights, land rights, environmental health rights, and then like specifically for this conversation, labor rights are a really big focus of this new revamped campaign. So as we're in this like campaign building phase right now, there are at least 2 reasons why we decided to really focus in and prioritize our engagement with auto manufacturers in the Uyghur region, or that are sourcing from the Uyghur region. So the first one is that China in general just plays an outsized role in the manufacturing of EVs. So outside of the extraction phase, or the mining phase of these key minerals, China leads in every subsequent stage of the supply chain and the manufacturing stages. And so, you know, China is a really big player in the game, and obviously, like the other reason is the seriousness of these, the seriousness and the urgency of these human rights abuses that are happening. The forced labor in the Uyghur region is one part of it, but as Johar explained, and as many others have explained in reports, there are so many other human rights abuses that are occurring in the Uyghur region. So as we are building this campaign in the moment, the first thing we did was launch this educational blog series, and I'll share the links to the ones we've published so far. But in these blog series, we made sure to highlight the issue of forced labor in the Uyghur region. Right before publishing our second blog, Driving Force was actually published, and it gave us something to really to give concrete facts and to cite in our blog series. Right now, we're trying to figure out which companies to focus on our efforts. We're also doing a lot of relationship building with other organizations, experts, etc. And lastly, we are currently, well, I won't say lastly, there are 2 more things we're doing at the moment. One of them is we're currently in the process of filing a floor proposal at Tesla. And this is it's not a very common tactic, but we were unable to meet the shareholder proposal filing deadline because the company kind of changed their AGM last minute. But we're filing a floor proposal, which is kind of a creative new type of thing, and we are asking the company to disclose more information on their sourcing from 2 different contexts. And the first one is cobalt from child labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And on the other hand, it is to look at their sourcing of any parts or materials from the Uyghur region. And so that's one of the things that is currently in process. And the other thing that I think Anita will mention shortly after is collaborating with Investor Alliance and other partner organizations to send out some investor letters to some of the auto manufacturers that are named in the driving force report. If I can go to the last slide, and I'll just finish up with a couple of lessons and opportunities that I think are just fundamental to keep in mind. So from IASJ's own experience, we've learned that collaboration is key. So, you know, as an investor group, we find it super important to work kind of in a multi-stakeholder fashion with other NGOs, experts, impacted stakeholders. And these this allows for more creative, effective, and appropriate solutions. The second thing is really relevant. The driving force report is very relevant for this point, and I think the importance of leveraging robust research. So for investor groups, a lot of times we feel constrained a bit because it is more difficult to appeal to the moral case, the human rights argument of why the company should be, you know, changing their behavior, respecting human rights, and often we have to, you know, use the business case to bolster our human rights arguments, and you know, we have to show that this represents a material risk to the company. So these reports, like Driving Force, Uyghurs for Sale previously, are very, very crucial for us to be able to cite in our different dialogues, proposals, other engagements with the companies. And I think the last point I wanted to make was that equally important is to leverage that political and regulatory momentum. So right now, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which recently came into force, is something we can really push in our dialogues and proposals, really show that and demonstrate how that represents a real material risk for the company. And then also, like the Senate Finance Committee, you know, recently sent letters to a handful of automakers asking them about their supply chains. So we can really capitalize on this momentum. So yeah, I just wanted to, finally to conclude by saying it's so important to work together and to especially involve, you know, affected persons and communities in the work that we do. I'll turn it over to Anita.
Thanks so much, Erin, for that. And that was a great overview. Let me just change the view and, you know, also invite my the panelists back online and to turn on their cameras. But I wanted to just kind of, you know, pick up from where what Erin really spoke about as well, which is really, you know, working together as a broader community. You know, investors, none of us can do this alone. And I think that these tiles on the screen, you know, show that this has to really be a collaborative effort. So hold on, let me see whether allow us to start video. I think you can do it now. Okay, great. And the same for Yalkun, right? So I'm going to be talking more about the investor engagement towards the end of the call. I really, you know, invite you to join us. You know, just building on Erin's point as well, the work that we have to do. Oh, I'm sorry, Johar, that you have to drop off right now, you know, and thank you for joining. I appreciate it. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to have you on the panel, but thank you again for sharing the experience. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, we have to say goodbye to Johar. So let me just take the time to introduce three other panelists that are joining us today. Two of them are also authors of the Driving Force report. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce introduce you to Dr. Kendall Solcito, who is the Executive Director of Nomagaya and has authored a number of reports on the Uyghur crisis, including, as I mentioned, the Driving Force Report. She's been in collaboration with the Sheffield of Hallam University and as well produced a number of other reports as well. She's an adjunct professor at the University of Denver Stern School of Law and holds a PhD in epidemiology and an M&A in journalism, blending disciplines and research methods on business and human rights. Since 2008, has carried out human rights due diligence processes on 6 continents across different industries, and since 2021 has been contributing to research linking global supply chains to the Uyghur region. So thank you for joining us. We also have Mia Rabkin, who Dr. Murphy also referred to her earlier on, and she's a student at Binghamton University, majoring in political science with a minor in genocide and mass atrocity prevention. She continues to be a research assistant with the Sheffield University, but in her spare time also is able to be an intern with us at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. So very happy to have her on board. And last but not least, Matthew Grock, who is a senior director at Mighty Earth, where he oversees the organization's decarbonization campaign, focusing on heavy industries, in particular steel and aluminum manufacturing, which is key in the automotive manufacturing sector. Matthew will provide an environmental justice lens to this discussion because, as we discussed, I mean, we have to look at risks to the environment and to people together. These are not risks that need to be looked at separately, but they are very much connected. And he will also help to bring to this discussion what needs to be done to ensure that all decarbonization efforts must respect and protect human rights, in particular those of communities impacted by the industry and of workers. Prior to joining Mighty Earth, he served as Deputy Director at Public Citizens Global Trade Watch Division. So, you know, again, we have a lot of folks on the line. We have a number of questions that have already come in, and I know Dr. Solcito has already answered a lot of them, and so it's putting us out of business really in this discussion. But I'm going to turn to the questions and let's see where we take it from here. And I guess I will throw it to, I'll try and throw it to the person who's able to answer this question. And maybe I can just start with one question relating to the report itself. So the question here is, what has been the response of companies featured in the report? Have you seen any positive steps, or conversely, lack of action or steps that may go backwards even? And I'm just going to join that with another question relating to as well, you know, the importance of the reaction or the automotive industry as a whole responding to this report. And so have you seen anything that maybe, you know, comes through from industry bodies relating to the automated industry? So I will throw that out to Kendall, Laura, Yalkun, Mia to start to kick us off.
I'll give it a start. I think this question also came to Aaron a little later down in the chat, so we should make sure to loop him in as well. You know, the response from car companies that I've spoken with runs the gamut. There's one company that reached out to say they couldn't figure out what we were talking about. And I asked if they had clicked on the footnotes and translated them into their local language and read them. And if they could do that, we could then have a conversation. And that resulted in them hiring a Chinese language researcher who carried out additional research into their suppliers, looking into Weibo and other sources, and a massive adjustment of their approach to procurement. Other companies have come back to us and said it would be impossible to even talk to their suppliers, therefore they can't solve this problem, which is not true. And some companies are just utterly non-responsive. So we've seen the whole range. We're not really looking at an industry acting like a cohesive whole. There seems to be there seem to be differences regionally. I think that in the US, there's more pressure coming from labor unions than in Europe. I think that in Europe, there's more pressure coming from the German law than, for example, the French duty of vigilance law. So it's a really fragmented response, but I'd love for others to jump in too.
I guess I'd also add that I see you, Mia. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. You can go. All right. So before I hopped on the call, I actually went through the corporate responses that Dr. Murphy listed in the annex. And kind of a common thread, just jumping off of what Dr. Salcido or Kendall said, was that they would say they launched an internal investigation of their matters. They would cite that their company did adhere to the United Nations Business and Human Rights guiding principles, and then deny the company's involvement, because I think plausible deniability is easier than not being involved in the region. Because once you say you are involved, you actually have to. It was the United States, you would have to take action.
And in Germany as well. I think Mia's absolutely right that what we get in the first instance is almost always a sentence that begins with, we at X company abhor forced labor. We have a supplier code of conduct that, all of our suppliers sign, and we just believe them. And that's usually the first letter we get. It's written by a legal team. It's, it's not written by the procurement people. It's not written by the compliance or the social responsibility office. It's written by the compliance office, right? It's written by the legal team. And that has, at this point, I've come to just accept that that's a legal standard and a necessity for the companies. Okay, fine. But we are now 2 months into the report being out. We're starting to see a little bit more action, a little bit more curiosity about what next steps will be. And then at the same time, as Kendall said, a little bit more aggressive pushback from certain companies. So we've received a letter from Continental, for instance, which is a parts manufacturer. I just received this letter this week, so it hasn't gone up on the corporate responses Mia was talking about, where they said, we've looked into it. We were exposed to one company in China. We wrote to them and said, who are you? And they said, okay, we'll take that off our website. Now, do I know for sure that that company is not a supplier just because that company agrees that to take their customer's name off the website? I don't know, but we are seeing companies saying we are actively investigating this. We are actively taking actions. But the other response that is maybe one of the more disturbing and concerning ones is that companies are saying two interrelated things. And because we've talked to a German governmentally organized sectoral group where automotive industry players in Germany get together and talk about their risk. They organized this meeting under the idea, the theme of remind me, politically sensitive contexts. So they're adopting Chinese language to describe the Uyghur region as a politically sensitive space that essentially silences companies from engaging and essentially makes them the puppets of the propaganda machine of the PRC. When the government calls the Uyghur region a politically sensitive region, it means stop talking about that. If you want to continue to do business here, stop talking. So they adopted that language. We, of course, said, okay, we have to stop using politically sensitive and stop being puppets of the government. But part of what that revealed was that they're saying, look, we have a choice between following the US law and keeping our Chinese market, and we will keep our Chinese market every damn day. That is what matters. And they also will say, we have to be careful about our Chinese employees, which of course is a concern. But what my response is that workers down your supply chains also work for you, even if you don't pay them directly. So what they're doing is choosing their 10 employees in a Shanghai office who they pay directly over the hundreds of people who work for them in their supply chain who are Uyghur and who are being forced to do that. And so I think we need to keep putting that. I know that the human rights angle isn't the most compelling one when it comes to billions of dollars in profit, but it is one that I think we have to keep putting on the table and reminding people that we need to be thinking about the risk to Uyghur people and not just the risk to your market you know, but I agree with you, Aaron. When we're thinking as investors, we need to think, how do we get companies to actually move? And that's a different question.
Can I also add one small thing here, just parenthesis? First of all, we know that the forced labor facilities in the region is massive, and what we have searched maybe is only part of it. And for example, I am from Komul, and while doing the research, I found out many facilities in the Komul that I was not aware of growing up there. There's a big mine just near my neighborhood, but I wasn't aware of it because it was a restricted area for civilians to enter, right? And then there are people who are like from other countries, who are from other cities, and who are not allowed to leave even their loved ones are sick, or even they need a surgery. They still have to work for the government to prove their loyalty to the system. So in this kind of facilities, we have to take action. And from the inside, I think the Chinese companies who are operating in the region is also taking countermeasures to such kind of reports or enforcements from the US or other countries. They are changing the names of their subsidiaries in the region, making it Xinjiang free. For example, if the company name involves Xinjiang, then it is easily searchable, but then they remove the Xinjiang and put some random other Chinese characters there. Or they are selling the subsidiary to another subsidiary just to look that they don't own the company on paper, but actually they do hold 100% of the share of that Xinjiang subsidiary, right? So in this sense, we have to be more careful. We have to do more research, and we have to make sure that the supply chain is clean, even if it is hard. But as long as we as researchers can do it on desk-based research, I think many companies with huge capacity, a lot of funding, a lot of employees, they can definitely make sure of it. So that would be my point to others' viewpoints.
Thanks so much for that, Yelkun. And we have a couple of questions from the investors, but I wanted to throw it to Matthew, who is here really to provide. I mean, he's been working on the environmental side of the house here, looking at decarbonization in one of the industries being the automotive industry, and really wanted to get your viewpoint to really bring into the space. What is it that your organization is doing? How have you seen companies responding to what's being discussed in the report? Because I know that you use that as part of the work that you do. And in fact, as well, adding to that, the investors that you have been working with. So Matthew.
Thank you very much, Anita, and thank you to all the speakers so far today. It's been amazing. And again, to Dr. Laura and everybody, I've been using your research in my work, so it's a real pleasure to be with you today. As director of the decarbonization campaign, I have a specific focus when it comes to steel and aluminum industry. And when we were looking at how we want to engage the industry, one of the things we were looking at is major consumers of both steel and aluminum. Obviously, the auto industry came to mind, but like one of the things we did look at is, over 50% of the world's steel and aluminum comes from China. And 90% of that is from dirty coal. And those were things that we're very, very aware of. So as we were beginning to look at some of the auto companies that we really wanted to address this issue with, GM really came to mind. GM put out in 2021, 2.1 million cars in the US market, 2.9 in the Chinese market. But there was, and this was the Horizon Advisory Report, which was released in March of last year, which actually connected General Motors along with Volkswagen and BMW, if I'm not mistaken, to aluminum producers in the Xinjiang region of China using forced Uyghur labor. So that really put GM on the map for us, because if you are talking about decarbonizing by 2040, which is a stated goal of General Motors, we have the belief that a clean car means carbon neutral and free of human rights abuses. And that is like where we started off our campaign, where it's like, if you really want to decarbonize your supply chain, you got to start with the dirty steel and aluminum. And that also starts with China. The human rights aspect was something that we brought into it because, it's difficult for me because you guys have been saying it's so hard to pitch people on this, but like coming from the environmental world, it's the human rights aspect that really brings people in. because it's not only that they're polluting, but like the fact that they're using forced Uyghur labor, human rights abuses, like that just ties it all together. We've also done research when it comes to bauxite mining and the indigenous rights that are being violated in places like Guinea and also in Australia. And we're also talking about the dirty, steel plants outside of Detroit that are polluting the environments of local communities. So when we are looking at the global automotive supply chain, in particular with steel and aluminum, it all comes down to dirty suppliers and people that are abusing either indigenous or forced Uyghur labor, or when it comes to local people and polluting their environment. The supply chain is dirty, but one thing we have really zeroed in on is the fact that there should be no human rights abuses, especially with forced Uyghur labor in any automotive supply chain. We just ran a Super Bowl campaign pushing back on GM on their new everybody in campaign. So we spent a few $100,000 with ads across the country really pushing back, and the Uyghur rights issue is center with the decarbonization issue for us, because they both run through China, and that's the work that we've been doing over the last 6 months. And again, thank you to everyone that's on this call, because I've been using your work to really put our campaign in motion.
No, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Matthew. And Laura, I saw you've put up your hand. I'm just conscious of the time, but wanted you to please respond and wrap up. And then I'm going to just throw it to Erin, and then we need to kind of wrap up, because 75 minutes clearly wasn't enough.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to mention something about what Matthew's saying, and Mighty Earth's work is amazing, and we're really lucky to be able to be on this call with you. But it's not unusual that companies that are willing to abuse the environment are willing to abuse their workers, or vice versa. These things tend to go hand in hand. And so what we really need to understand is that in the Uyghur region, where they're using forced labor, they're also using coal to produce what they're claiming to be ultra low carbon, or to be a circular economy produced products. So these are some of the most polluting products. It's not just the lead that's being leached into the environment, but also mercury emissions and coal carbon emissions, because all of this is being powered by coal. The Uyghur region holds 40% of the country's coal reserves, and that's part of why everything is moving to this region. So these efforts by human rights activists and environmental activists need to go hand in hand, because the products that are being made in the Uyghur region, whether it's solar panels or EV batteries, et cetera, or low carbon steel, et cetera, are all really the most polluting forms of those things that you could possibly buy. And so doing these efforts together is critical. So I'm really glad to be on this call together today.
Yeah, thanks for that. And, we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to share some information about the investor engagement that we've been coordinating since 2020 relating to the Uyghur region. And it's a coordinated engagement. We do this together with civil society like Dr. Laura Murphy, Dr. Salcido, Yalkun and Mia, and as well with the impacted communities through our engagement with the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, as we heard from Johar. We have an investor guidance out, and so if anyone has any questions, please contact me. My email address is on this slide. So thank you very much. But Erin, I was going to actually throw it to you as we close. To just I think you may have seen the questions in the box. Really, how best is it for investors to really engage on the issue? I think building on the point around having to look at a multi-stakeholder approach. So Erin, over to you to close us off.
Sure, it's a very difficult question, I think. Yeah, I would emphasize that multi-stakeholder approach. I don't think I would use the term multi-stakeholder initiative per se, but I guess I use it loosely as working with other NGOs, experts, affected communities and peoples. And I think it goes to a little bit about that second question that talked about how can we maybe not look so politicized, or we're taking a political view. I guess I would push back and just say that human rights shouldn't be a political and aren't a political issue. I think, advocating for human rights is apolitical. And, I guess in a sense, understanding a little bit about the subtext of that question, there are different strategies to engage with companies. And I think one of the benefits of these multi-stakeholder groups is, first of all, as investors, we're free to send private letters to companies, have private dialogues. We can design how private or public something is, which can help maybe with our public image. But then within these groups, there are different groups that push different points at the company. That some publish things, some have a dialogue with companies, some don't. And so I think the benefit of meeting with these groups and like understanding who can play what role best helps with a more coordinated and concerted effort. So I would wrap it up with that probably.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for staying on this call. We had, more than 80 attendees. We will share more information as well. And I really wanted to thank each and every speaker for sharing their personal time as well as their professional time with us. And please do join our investor engagement. This is not the last conversation we'll be having with this group of people, because as part of the investor engagement, this group of people actually joins our calls and helps together create a strategy for the engagement. So we don't do this alone. We do this in a multi-stakeholder approach. And that will be how we take this forward with the engagement campaign that we are coordinating at the Investor Alliance. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.